By the autumn of 1944, a harsh and frightening reality had settled in for American tank crews fighting their way across Western Europe, because the M4 Sherman, the dependable mass-produced backbone of U.S. armored forces, was increasingly being outgunned, outranged, and outclassed by Germany's formidable Panther and Tiger tanks, creating what frontline soldiers grimly referred to as Panther Panic. A sense of dread rooted not in rumor but in lived battlefield experience, as GIs wrote desperate letters home and up the chain of command pleading for a tank that could finally meet German armor on equal terms. And on paper that answer appeared to exist in the form of the M26 Pershing, a 46-ton heavy tank boasting thick sloped armor and a powerful 90mm gun capable of penetrating Panthers and Tigers from the front, making it seem like the very weapon American tankers had been praying for, which is precisely why it came as a shock, almost an act of betrayal to some, when General George S. Patton, Jr., the most famous, aggressive, and successful American tank commander of the war, openly opposed halting Sherman production in favor of building the Pershing, a stance that seemed utterly contradictory to his reputation as old blood and guts, a man who preached relentless attack and overwhelming force, leading many to ask how such a commander could possibly reject a bigger, better, and more heavily armed tank at a moment when his own men were dying inside burning Shermans. Yet the answer to that question reveals a deeper, often misunderstood truth about warfare itself and about Patton's uniquely strategic and operational way of thinking, because to understand his logic one must first understand the terror he appeared to be ignoring, namely the German Panther, which many historians consider the best all-around tank of the Second World War, combining 80mm of well-sloped frontal armor, effectively immune to the Sherman's standard 75mm gun at most combat ranges, with a long-barreled high-velocity 75mm cannon capable of destroying a Sherman from well over a mile away under ideal conditions, while the Sherman's thinner, largely vertical armor earned it the morbid nickname Ronson Lighter among its crews, based on the grim belief that it lights up the first time, every time. A reputation that post-war historians such as Stephen Zaloga have shown to be statistically exaggerated, since Shermans did not burn more frequently than other tanks when penetrated, but for the men inside the tank such statistical nuance meant little, because the tactical reality was brutal and immediate. In the close hedgerows of Normandy, engagement ranges were often just a few hundred yards, where maneuver and surprise could still offer a fighting chance, but once the fighting moved into more open terrain such as Lorraine, engagement ranges increased dramatically, allowing Panthers and Tigers to dominate, forcing American tankers into desperate flanking maneuvers and costly numerical assaults that sometimes required sacrificing 4 or 5 Shermans to knock out a single German tank, creating an overwhelming sense that they were fighting inside a death trap and intensifying their demand for a tank like the Pershing that could finally fight head-to-head and survive. Yet the critical disconnect lay in the fact that George Patton was not fighting the same war as the individual tanker crouched inside his steel hull, because Patton was, at heart, the last great horse cavalryman, a commander whose entire understanding of warfare, from his early days chasing Pancho Villa with motorized columns to his interwar development of American armor doctrine, was built on the principles of speed, exploitation, and relentless forward momentum, viewing tanks not as armored fortresses meant to slug it out in static duels, but as mechanized cavalry designed to penetrate, exploit, and collapse the enemy system, a philosophy encapsulated in his famous dictum, "Hold them by the nose and kick them in the pants," meaning that infantry and artillery would fix the enemy in a brutal frontal engagement while fast-moving armored divisions swept around the flanks and deep into the rear, severing supply lines, destroying headquarters, spreading panic, and turning orderly defense into chaos. And for this doctrine to work, Patton did not need the best individual tank on the battlefield, but rather the right tank for the overall system, one that was fast enough to exploit breakthroughs, reliable enough to operate hundreds of miles behind enemy lines without constant breakdowns, light enough to cross Europe's aging bridges without delays, and available in such vast numbers that losses, however painful, could be absorbed without halting the advance, and in Patton's mind the M4 Sherman fulfilled those requirements better than any alternative, a belief rooted not in ignorance of its flaws but in deep practical experience, because he knew exactly how vulnerable the Sherman was and consistently pushed for improvements such as the 76mm gun and better ammunition to improve its combat effectiveness, yet he valued three core strategic virtues above all else, the first being reliability, as the Sherman, especially his favored M4A3 variant with the Ford V8 engine, proved to be a marvel of mechanical dependability compared to German tanks, which were often over-engineered, complex machines plagued by frequent breakdowns, exemplified by the Panther's notoriously fragile final drive with a service life sometimes measured in less than 150 kilometers, whereas a Sherman was a rugged workhorse that simply kept moving, and Patton understood that a Tiger immobilized by mechanical failure was little more than a stationary pillbox, while a running Sherman could still shape the battle and the campaign, the second virtue being speed and mobility, as the Sherman could maintain a strategic road speed of 25 to 30 miles per hour, allowing armored columns to move at the tempo Patton demanded during the race across France, keeping German forces off balance and preventing them from establishing coherent defensive lines, while its relatively light weight, around 33 tons, meant it could cross the vast majority of European bridges without waiting for engineers to construct heavy pontoon crossings, a factor that mattered enormously in high-speed exploitation, and the third virtue being sheer numbers, because the United States produced nearly 50,000 Shermans during the war, giving commanders like Patton confidence that losses could be replaced quickly through an unparalleled logistical system, a reality he openly acknowledged in correspondence with the Ordnance Department, where he praised the Sherman's mechanical excellence and emphasized that victory depended on getting there the fastest with the mostest. Yet when Patton evaluated the M26 Pershing through this same strategic lens, its strengths transformed into liabilities, because at 46 tons it was 13 tons heavier than the Sherman, making it far more difficult to transport, more demanding on fuel at a time when Patton was constantly fighting supply shortages, and too heavy for standard pontoon bridges, meaning every river crossing would become a slow, deliberate, and contested operation, the very opposite of the rapid, fluid warfare he believed was essential to victory, while the Pershing was also mechanically unproven, equipped with a new engine and transmission that were arguably underpowered for its weight, and Patton, who envisioned armored spearheads racing hundreds of miles into enemy territory, had little patience for equipment that might break down mid-advance, preferring the known, reliable quantity of the Sherman over the powerful but uncertain promise of a new heavy tank, especially when switching production lines in late 1944 would have caused a significant drop in the total number of tanks reaching the front, something utterly unacceptable to a commander who constantly demanded more men, more fuel, more ammunition, and more vehicles to keep the advance moving, which brings us to the heart of the debate over who was right, Patton or the tankers who desperately wanted the Pershing, and the nuanced truth is that both were right because they were fighting two different wars, as the individual tank crewman was fighting a tactical war of survival measured in hundreds of yards, where his immediate concern was defeating the enemy tank in front of him and staying alive long enough to see the next day, a mission for which the Pershing, with its heavier armor and more powerful gun, was undeniably the superior tool, while Patton was fighting an operational and strategic war measured across the entire map of Western Europe, where his responsibility was not to win individual tank duels but to encircle, shatter, and destroy entire German armies, a mission that favored speed, reliability, and numerical superiority over individual battlefield dominance. Meaning that while Patton was fully aware of the Sherman's shortcomings and the suffering they caused, he believed that its strategic virtues, the very qualities that allowed sustained, high-speed maneuver warfare, ultimately outweighed its tactical vices, making the Sherman versus Pershing debate one of the clearest historical examples of the difference between the best weapon and the best war-winning system. Because while the men inside the turrets understandably cursed thin armor and inferior Guns. The commander directing the campaign saw a reliable workhorse capable of sustaining relentless movement, and Patton's preference was therefore not an indictment of the Pershing's capabilities but a testament to his unwavering belief in a specific doctrine of high-speed, offensive warfare, a choice made not for a single battle or a single crew, but for the campaign as a whole, leaving us with a timeless question that still resonates in military history. Was Patton right to prioritize strategic mobility and operational momentum, or were the tankers right to demand greater protection and firepower? A question that ultimately reflects the enduring tension between winning battles and winning wars.